Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank all of you who have been brave and come out on a snowy day here to the Old State House for our program with Mark Twain today. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm the head of public programs here. And before you leave this afternoon, I'd recommend that perhaps you stop in our shop because we have a couple of very nice items for sale, including note cards and an Old State House ornament. So if you want to send a flavor of Connecticut, definitely check that out. I also wanted to remind you that today's program is part of our Conversations at Noon series. Next month, on January the 22nd, we'll hold a conversation at noon on Black Hartford and the modern civil rights movement. I want to extend our thanks to Connecticut Humanities, who were generous enough to fund our public programs here at the Old State House. And I'd also like to remind you about another event in January. On the 14th, join us for our town hall meeting, which is held in the evening. And the topic of the town hall meeting will be Out of the Shadows, a community conversation about mental health. And now, for today's program. For 17 years, John Pogson has been popping up everywhere, not as himself, but as Hartford, Connecticut's very own author and wit, Samuel Clemens, who most of us know better by his pen name of Mark Twain. Pogson has made numerous appearances on national and international television and radio, and can currently be seen in an award-winning documentary on PBS titled Mark Twain's Neighborhood, Nook Farm. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Mark Twain.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all here today. The thing that you didn't say is we have a little surprise for you all when it's all through. We have gathered together $1 million, and we're all going to share it for anyone that decided to come out today. So anybody that didn't come out today, well, you've missed out on a little because we're all getting a larger share now. Well, welcome to the Old State House. It's an honor to be here today, and I will do my best not to tarnish this building's wonderful reputation. I guess I should get on to the business at hand, and I don't like introductions, and I never really have. And I've always felt that if an introduction was to be the custom, why I far prefer to do the act myself, and that way I can be assured as getting in all the appropriate facts and figures, if there are any figures to be gotten in. Well, my dislike, it didn't begin here today. It began at one of my very first lectures. It was to be held in Carson County, which was located in the Carson Territories. And I believe you all call it Carson City, Nevada, nowadays. My Carson City was a wild place. It was a violent place. It was a mining town. Why, there was hanging, there was some gunslinging, there was some claim jumping, occasional murder, and a duel or two. It was no place for a Presbyterian, and I didn't remain one for very long. Well, I was to be introduced to a rather large group of people by a miner who I was fairly certain had been doing a little bit of drinking. And the reason I was fairly certain he'd been doing a little bit of drinking, mind you, is that I was with him. Well, it took a lot of coaxing, and finally we got him up in front of the group, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it is my job today to introduce you to a Mr. Mark Twain." He said, "There's only one problem with the whole thing." He said, and that's that I don't know a damn thing about him. He said, "Well, I do know one or two things." He said, "One, I know that he ain't never been in jail. And the other is that I don't know why." So there you have it. That was the fatal blow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to a man whose veneration for the truth are only outdone by his high, upstanding moral caliber and majestic presence. And I am referring in these vague and very, very general terms to myself, Mark Twain, born Samuel Langhorne Clemens in 1835. Why, I was born in the almost invisible community of Florida. Monroe County, Missouri. Why, Florida, it had a population of 100. And when I arrived, why, I increased that population by 1%. And that is more than many of the greatest men in history have ever been able to do for a town. Why, I looked it up. Not Kipling, not Dickens, why, not even Shakespeare had such an influence over a town. But I did. It just goes to show I probably could have done it for some far-flung place like Hartford, Connecticut, had I have set my mind to it. Well, I should, I guess, mention a few things. I came into this world with Halley's Comet in 1835. And God no doubt said that I have created these two unaccountable freaks of nature. When they came into this world together, smoking, and I believe they should leave it together. Why, it'll be the greatest disappointment in my life if I don't go out when it returns. Halley's Comet's coming again in 1910. My wife, Olivia, she always tells me that I am working on it because I smoke 20 cigars a day. Well, I told her, Olivia, I'm working on becoming an angel. And I ain't become one yet, but I will. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about myself. Why, I was born 2 months premature. And I remember, I was a sickly child, but I remember asking my mother about it. She always told me I was a tiresome and sickly child, and she tried any manner of remedies to get me better. Well, she didn't kill me. In any case, when she was in her 80s, I asked her, I said, Mother, were you worried about me? She said, why, yes, Sammy, I was. I said, Mother, were you worried the whole time? She said, yes, Sammy, I was. I was worried the whole time. I said, Mother, were you afraid that I wouldn't live? Why, she thought about it for a moment, ostensibly to think over the facts. And then she responded, no, Sammy, I was afraid you would. So there you have it. Now you know where I got my sense of humor. I didn't get it from my father. He was never quite happy. I don't think I ever saw him smile. He was always worried about things like money, keeping the family going together. Well, I attended school when I was a child, and I attended school at the place where the use of a birch rod. It wasn't an uncommon event. You see, it was against the rules to mark the desks in that school in any manner whatsoever. And the penalty was a public whipping with the birch rod, or a fine of $5. And if you were lucky enough, you were allowed to make the choice. Well, I had been spending summers on my Uncle John's farm. It was a beautiful place. Why, and I would play with my cousins, and I would play with the slaves that they happened to have, because they were from Missouri, and that was considered rather normal. Of course, it wasn't the brutal plantation slavery that we all hear about. And he had given me a penknife. It was the most shiny, beautiful little penknife that you've ever seen in your entire life. It was sharp as a razor. Well, I went back to school, and I couldn't stand it. I spent one entire day carving the most beautiful SLC that you've ever seen in your entire life in the top of the desk. Probably, as I look back at it nowadays, probably would have been smarter had I have carved someone else's initials into the desk. Seeing how there were only 13 people in the classroom, and I was the only one that had the initials SLC. Well, I was caught. And I was offered the alternatives. And I went home, and I told my father what had occurred. And for some reason that day, he felt it would be a bad thing for me to be publicly punished. So he gave me the $5. $5 in the 1840s was an astronomical sum of money. It was a small fortune Well, to me, a public whipping with that birch rod was of little or no consequence whatsoever. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of how I earned my first $5. Well, my formal education ended at the age of 12 when my father passed away, and that woman with the sense of humor apprenticed me out to be an apprentice printer to help make the money for the family. But my education did continue in lecture halls, silver mines, riverboat cabins, and everywhere I went for the rest of my life. I always said that I never, ever let my schooling interfere with my education. Well, I went on through early life as a printer's apprentice and a typesetter in Hannibal, Missouri, New York City, Ohio, Pennsylvania, a little bit in Washington. And that got me out of that small slaveholding community that I was in and showed me the excitement of other parts of the world and opened my eyes to the corruption, political and otherwise, that they held. I believe that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's life. And I certainly have done a bit of traveling. I have traveled all over the world, and I have seen all of the foreign lands that I ever wanted to see, with the exception of perhaps heaven and maybe hell. And I only have a vague curiosity as would regard one of those. Well, in 1859, I became a riverboat pilot. I was 24 years old, and I studied under a gentleman named Horace Bixby. He was a wonderful man. Well, the politics of the day brought that to a halt. It was time for civil war by the North and the Unions fighting for the freedom of the slaves. And the Southern states, why, they had seceded from the United States or the Union, and they were fighting for exactly the opposite purpose. I believe it's always good if we were going to have a war, why, to have opposite purposes. Otherwise, there'd be no real reason to do it. We seem to be pretty good at it. Well, I also believe that war is a horrible thing. As I was saying, the war broke out. The South, why, it stopped flow on the river from the North. The North stopped flow on the river from the South. And I was sure that if I stayed where I was, that I was going to be made a Union gunboat pilot. And I had no desire whatsoever to get involved with that. So I headed back to Missouri because I felt I was safe there. And I joined a local militia called the Marion Rangers. Well, we spent about 2 weeks running away, hiding from people. And finally we decided, or I decided anyway, that it wasn't worth getting shot at over. So the group disbanded. And most of the gentlemen went on to become regular Army, and I ran in another direction. I wound up going west. But I always said that I could have been a good soldier had I have put my mind to it. Why, I knew more about retreating than the man that invented retreating. I believe that God created war to teach us all geography. Now, there's something to think about. I had first-hand experience with political graft, and it changed my life as I knew it. My older brother, Orion, see, he had been working hard with the Republican Party. to get Abraham Lincoln elected. And at the time, I had little or no real political alliance. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be North or whether I wanted to be South. You know, there was war going on, so the best thing I could think of doing was to get out of the way. Now, after Lincoln was elected president, my brother was compensated. He was paid off in a manner of speaking. He was appointed secretary to the Secretary of the Midwestern Territories. Well, I begged him, and I begged him, and I begged him. And finally, he succumbed to my assault, and he took me with him as his secretary. So I had the dubious distinction of being secretary to the Secretary of the Midwestern Territories. That was my first official title. I try and say that 3 times fast. But it did get me away from the Civil War, and it carried me in a different direction. Well, while I was out there with him, I witnessed firsthand the politics of the day and how they were working. The legislature of the area, which was new, instituted a $10,000 agricultural fair to display $40 worth of pumpkins. I am sure that the farmer had done someone a favor, and I'm sure he also gave a little bit of that money back. The territorial legislature out in that area was usually considered or called the asylum. Well, so I decided to try my hand at silver mining and gold mining, and I wound up by being a reporter for the local paper. And I'm quite sure now that often, very often, in matters concerning politics and religion, that a man's reasoning is not above the monkeys. Now, I wrote for the Galaxy magazine at one point in my life, and in an article I wrote that I shall not often meddle with politics, because we have a political editor who is already excellent and only needs to serve a term or two in the penitentiary, to be perfect. Yeah, there's another job that didn't last very long. I have a rather cynical look on politics after all of these years. And some say why I have a poor opinion, or a mighty poor opinion. I've always said that it is a well-founded poor opinion. And I believe that the political and commercial morals of the United States are not merely food for laughter. I believe they are the entire banquet. And I believe to lodge all power in one party and keep it there is bad government and the sure and gradual deterioration of public morals. Now, that'll come out in a biography someday that I think you all might like to read. Might be in 100 years or so. I believe that an honest man in politics shines there more than he would elsewhere. I believe in loyalty to country, always, and loyalty to government when it deserves it. Yes, you are right. I am a moralist in disguise, and it gets me into heaps of trouble when I go thrashing around in political questions like I have been doing here today. And now, finally, in my defense, I would rather have my ignorance than another man's knowledge, because I have so much more of it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is a terrible death, to be talked to death. And so I will end my short rant here today, and I will share the rest of that responsibility with Ms. Diane Smith. And I believe that we will discuss, come right on up, Diane, that we'll discuss some politics in Hartford, perhaps, and family and friends, perhaps political corruption of the day, maybe slavery. Tammany Hall, I have a lot to say about that. And my relationship with General Grant, perhaps, who knows, whatever you might like. So I sincerely hope that I haven't offended here today. But if I have in any way, not to worry, because it won't be the first or the last time that I do it. So thank you again for coming. I do appreciate it. Thank you. Diane, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It is certainly a pleasure.
Well, thank you, and a pleasure for me, too, but I
We
wonder...
are having water, aren't we?
I am, yes.
Okay,
it is water, yes. We think. Is it Mark, or shall I call you Sam?
You may call me whatever you like. Just please call me. And call me regularly.
Okay, I'll call you Mark then. Mark, tell us a little bit about why you chose to make Hartford your home, of all the places you've traveled to.
Hartford, Connecticut. I actually have a little letter that I'm going to read to you all about my first impressions of Hartford. But Hartford was such a beautiful place. Hartford, Connecticut was the publishing capital of the world. And most people don't realize that. Before it became the insurance capital, it was the publishing capital, and there was a lot going on. We had the largest per capita income here than any state in the country. And the residents, boy, they didn't mind spending it. And it was just a marvelous place to be. But I do have a rather entertaining letter. Do you mind if I read it?
I'd love to hear it.
It's not very long, but it's about my first impressions of Hartford. And it goes back to it was 73 when I was visiting and looking for a house and staying at a boarding house with some friends. And it starts out, of all the beautiful places it has been my fortune to see, this is the chief. Everywhere the eye turns, it's filled with a luscious sense of greenery. I'm in Hartford, Connecticut now. It's January 25th, but I am confident that I shall get this letter finished yet if I keep at it. I think this is the best built and handsomest town I have ever seen. Why, they call New England the land of steady habits. And I see the evidence about me that it was not named amiss. Why, as I came along to Principal Street today, by smoking, of course, I noticed that of the 200 men in sight at one time, only 2 were smoking besides myself. I had to walk 3 blocks to find a cigar store. I saw no drinking saloons at all in the street, but I wasn't looking for any. I hear no one swearing. I see no drinking saloons at all. I see no one chewing tobacco. I have found nobody drunk. What a singular country it is. Why, at the hospitable mansion where I'm a guest, I have to smoke surreptitiously when all are in bed to save my reputation. And then draw suspicion upon the cat. Why, when the family detects the unfamiliar odor. Why, I have never been so proper in the broad light of day in my life as I have been for the last day or so. So far, I'm safe, but I'm sorry to say that the cat has lost caste. She has steadily decreased in popularity since I made my advent here, and she's achieved a reputation for smoking, and may be justly regarded as a degraded, a dishonored, and a ruined cat. They have the broadest and straightest streets in Hartford that ever led a sinner to destruction. And the dwelling houses are the amplest in size and have the most shapely and capacious ornamental grounds about them. What an inspiring place it was to write. But those are my first impressions of Hartford, and I always love to share them because they were pretty much off the cuff at the time, and I was writing that letter to a dear friend.
Yeah. And you ended up not buying a house, but building quite a house.
Yes,
Do tell.
We have a lovely, lovely house over on Nook Farm. And my wife Olivia's father helped us along with that. He had purchased a house for us in Buffalo prior to. And maybe I should tell that story because we came to Hartford shortly after that. But we arrived in Buffalo after our marriage and our wedding. And we were picked up in sleighs. by Olivia's father and her brother. And we were driven all around the town. It was nighttime, and it was cold. It was a snowy day, just like it is here today. And we were looking for a boarding house. And he took us everywhere. And finally, he pulled up in front of the most lovely little palace that you have ever seen in your entire life. Well, I looked at him and I said, "Sir," I said, "people who can afford to live in this manner, why, they won't take boarders." And he looked back at me and he said, "Sam," he said, "it's your house." He said, "We have purchased it for you." And they furnished it. It was completely furnished. And they provided us with 3 servants to call us Mr. and Mrs. Clemens instead of Sam and Livy. Well, the reason I say that is because in the drawing room here in Hartford, we have all the furniture that we brought from Buffalo. So if you ever decide to come by, you'll see all of that lovely stuff hanging there, and the beautiful mirror and our chairs and the chandelier all came from the Buffalo house. We had a little problem up there. Olivia's father passed away there a year or so down the road. And we moved to Hartford. One of the reasons for going to Buffalo is that I wanted to buy into a newspaper, and I wanted part of it. And I mentioned it to the Hartford Current, and they wouldn't have anything to do with me. Buffalo Express would, however. So I spent some time with the Buffalo Express, and then came to Hartford, and always wanted to be a Nook Farm, because there were wonderful people there. I mean, we had Harriet Beecher Stowe on one side, and we had Charles Warner in the back on the other side. And Charles and I had gotten together and written a little book at one point in time. We were sitting on the Umbra one afternoon with our wives, and we were complaining.
Surprisingly.
Which is certainly something that's very easy for me to do. But we were complaining that there was no good literature of the day. And our wives stared at us. They said, "You two," they said, if you don't like it, why don't you get together and write your own book?" Well, we took the dare, and we did. We got together and we wrote a book in a very, very short amount of time. And it was called The Gilded Age. So we did well.
That period of time came to be known as the Gilded Age. What inspired that precise title and that moniker?
It had nothing to do with the martini. No, but we did. We got together and decided it would be a good thing to look at the politics of the day and what was going on and the overall corruption and money that was being spent. And that almost leads me to the Tammany Hall, part of what I was saying a little bit earlier, and I had quite a bit to say about that, and the political corruption that was going on.
And Tammany Hall, of course, being the machine that ran New York City and indeed much of New York State.
And there was a time when the new courthouse was being built, and these are just little items that get me going. Mm-hmm. I had been in a little bit of trouble for writing about politics and some corruption within the law, etc., and even out west when I was out there. But we thought that if we did it in a manner that was entertaining, we could still get our point across, and perhaps the book would sell. But Tammany Hall at the time, I think the best story, or a couple of short little stories, is that, first of all, Tammany Hall was to be built for $250,000 from start to finish. And this was at a time where the machine politics, the politicians were trying to gain more power. The railroads were going on up there. The politicians were purchasing land, useless, worthless land. And then they were getting together after the land was purchased, and they would vote on building something on that land to make it quite valuable, and then sell it for huge profits. So it was legalized graft, really. Well, I said that the building was to be built for $250,000. How much do you think it wound up costing? I'm not going to put you on the spot.
I'm going to suggest a bit more than that, perhaps.
It was a little bit more. It wound up costing the taxpayers $13 million.
Wow.
Now,
an astonishing amount of money at the time.
It was an amazing amount of money, and it came out of the people's pockets. Well, things were done. For example, they purchased, I want to say $180,000 was spent on 2 desks and 40 chairs. They spent $1.5 million on writing fixtures. Mind you, the entire building was to be built and start to finish for $250,000. They paid $48,000 for brooms. And I think that the best or the biggest was that there was a plasterer who was hired to do all of the ornate plaster work, as there is in this building in places. And he was paid or commissioned $500,000 for that. Now, to take it one step further, he was granted another $1 million contract to repair his shoddy workmanship. Now, the typical payoff of the day for Tammany Hall, and it can all be looked up, was $2 paid to, it was $2 paid to the politicians for every $1 that was spent or billed by the contractor. So it was a 2-to-1. Now, the contractor that got the job to do the $500,000 worth of plaster, which was probably a $20,000 job, was happy and content because he had received his $500,000. And the politicians of the day were quite happy to receive their $1 million, which was the 2-for-1 payment. So it was running pretty rampant. They would do other things, and I think that this is wonderful, wonderfully curious. They would go out during an election time, and they would find bearded men. There's a gentleman in the audience with a beard. We could use him for an example. But they would corral all of these gentlemen, and they'd bring them in to vote. Then they would remove them, have them shave their beards, and then bring them back in to vote again. And then they get one more out of it. They'd bring them out and have them shave their mustaches and go back in and vote again. So the politics of the day were running rampant. And these are just a few examples of some of the things that...
Well, let's talk a little bit about your kind of circle of friends here in Hartford, because you said what a beautiful city it was and that the per capita income was quite high. So there must have been quite a few interesting people that you came to know here.
Well, certainly. There were quite a few. I had my dearest friend ever was Reverend Joseph Twitchell. And he was the pastor at the Asylum Hill Congregational Church. And churches typically don't have a tremendous amount of money. I used to call this church, they were trying to build a steeple. And they spent quite a long time trying to build that steeple and raised money in any manner that they could. And I used to joke with them and call it the church of the holy speculators, so that they would get their steeple built. But we spent a lot of time together. We traveled extensively. There was a time when I left Hartford for a couple of years and went to Switzerland and a number of other places. And I traveled with the Reverend. And we had a marvelous time for 2 years going through the Black Forest and the Alps and spending time writing.
What was the reason for that travel?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. One, I was doing some research for a book, and the book wound up coming out. It was A Tramp Abroad. And the other was that I was a little bit embarrassed that I had offended some of the very good writers of the day. I had given a speech in Boston, and it was for her 70th birthday. And I said some things that I probably shouldn't have. You know, I've learned how to behave a little bit since then. And it was quite embarrassing. So when I came back to Hartford, I thought it would be a good idea to make myself scarce for a little bit and perhaps come out with something in the long run. And it turned out to be quite a wonderful trip that we had. And the sights that we saw could never have been seen if I had stayed. So,
what was it like being a neighbor of Harriet Beecher Stowe? What was she like? And did the two of you get on?
We did get along. There was a bit of an age difference between us. Many people think that Harriet Beecher Stowe and myself were contemporaries, but we really weren't. We were a generation apart. And Harriet was quite a lady. She had the little house across the way And that was more or less their summer home. And in the winters, they used to travel to Florida, of all places. And they would go down where it was warm. But there was one specific occasion where I decided, we had an open door policy in our neighborhood. And I thought it would be a good idea to go and pay Harriet a visit. So I went over, and I opened her door and said hello, and we sat and had a wonderful chat and spent quite a bit of time together. And I came home, and my wife, Olivia, was mortified. Why, she was furious with me, and she would get furious with me occasionally, and rightfully so. But this time, it was because I went and I visited Harriet without wearing my tie, and without wearing my collar, and without wearing my gloves. And she was just mortified that I would leave the house and actually go and visit someone this way. Well, I thought the best thing I could do was to get George Griffin. And George was our head of household, our male head of household. Katie Leary was the other side. I had George produce a silver platter. It was beautiful. It was about this big. And on it, I put my collar and my hat and my gloves, and I sent them over to Harriet. Well, just to show you that she had a sense of humor. George came back about 20 minutes later, and he had a note, as well as all of my material. And I looked at the note, and it said, Mr. Clemens, it said, I never realized that a gentleman could visit in installments. So it satisfied Olivia's need to have me show up dressed properly. But Harriet did have a sense of humor, and she was quite something. You know, she was a gardener, and she'd be out in her yard, and Charles Warner was a wonderful gardener as well, and he was on the other side of things. So it was quite a place, you know. And any time you wanted to get together and discuss literature or pretty much anything, you could with anyone in that neighborhood. And occasionally, well, I hate to say it, Harriet was getting a bit older, and occasionally she would stop over unannounced in the middle of the night. She might play the piano a little. And we learned that was all right. I mean, she meant no harm. And she was quite a lovely woman. And she wrote a rather telling book about slavery as well.
Yes, I would say so.
As well as many
Tom's
others.
Cabin.
But
Yes.
she did her thing for the fight.
You did talk a little bit about your place in the Civil War, and in this building today, we have been, over the last year or so, commemorating the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. As it all turned out, what was your opinion?
Well, let me just talk a little bit about the Civil War, because we never would have had a Mark Twain had it not have been for the Civil War. You would have been listening to someone called W. Epaminondas Adrastus Perkins. That was my first nom de plume. Well, Mark Twain happened to be a gentleman that wrote river news, and he was a riverboat pilot. And he was a rather gruff gentleman. I didn't like him very much. And I believe that when I thought he had passed away, his name was up for grabs. And I wound up taking it and riding with that out west. But when the war broke out, and I went west to Carson County, I believe that my entire life changed, and I wound up being a writer as opposed to other things. Now, the war was about slavery. And when I was a youngster growing up in Hannibal, Hannibal was a slaveholding state, and I never realized that there was anything really wrong about it. You see, the local newspapers, they spoke in favor. The local pulpit, they spoke in favor of slavery, while your parents told you that slavery was all right. And if you were in a small enough community and you never got out in the world and traveled, as I said earlier, you wouldn't have known that there was any difference or anything to be worried about. But having had traveled and seeing the brutal treatment that was being put upon the slaves, I just couldn't abide it. I at one point in time saw a dozen men and women chained together, and they were waiting for sale, men and women and children alike, and they were the saddest faces that you have ever seen in your entire life. And I believe that war resulted in something good, and it did result in the doing away with slavery to a certain extent. It took many years after that. But I never really wanted to fight.
I do want to talk to you about someone who I think became a hero of yours that was first really well known to people because of the Civil War, and that's U.S. Grant.
Oh, Hiram Grant. Do you know that his name actually was Hiram Ulysses Grant?
It's not.
And that when he got himself into West Point, or he was gotten into West Point, the enrollment officer misread his name, and it was Hiram Ulysses Grant. And he assigned him the name Ulysses, and then S, which was his mother's first initial of his mother's maiden name. And he decided not to change it. So he stuck with Ulysses for the rest of his life. But he was quite a gentleman. Now, I never, ever once called him president. I called him general. And I spent a number of days with him. I wound up working with him on his memoirs. And getting back to the politics of the day, his administration was considered the most corrupt in history at the time. And I don't believe for 1 second that he had anything to do with it. He was a gentleman that would go out of his way to do whatever he could possibly do for you. Lost all of their family money in something called a Ponzi scheme. He had invested after the presidency in a brokerage firm in New York City with his son, and they had a partner. And the partner swindled them both out of all of the money that they had. So the Grant family was impoverished. The general was quite a mild-spoken man, and he was actually a little bit afraid to speak in public, and he had tried to publish some material prior to, but didn't feel that he was a very good writer either. But actually, he was an amazing writer. He would have his generals or his people in the field write him accounts of the battles that happened on a regular basis, and then he would sit back about once a month, and he would write the account of what had actually occurred without looking what they had written at, really. And they were almost identical.
And so was it your idea that he ought to write his memoir? Because I understand that actually helped his family come out of debt after his death.
Well, it did. They had such a small amount of money that the general, he was willing to take $1,500 for his work. And, I caught wind of that. And in speaking with him, told him that the advance on his book should be no less than $25,000 or $30,000, and that if I were to get involved with it, I would sell it in subscription form, and that would be good for book agents going to town, selling books, making money. And I tried and tried and tried, and he gave a hard time with it. But by this time, he was on Mount McGregor, which is just outside of Saratoga Springs. And I went to visit him, and he was quite ill at the time. He as well had smoked 20 cigars a day, and that had caused him some problem. Finally, he agreed, and so we published it with Webster Publishing, which was my publishing company that I opened for a while, and finally that failed. But it was the biggest success that the publishing company had, and I was able to go back 2 weeks prior to the book being published. The general, he passed away. And an interesting thing, interesting note of the day is that they closed his house that very day. And to this very day, it remains exactly as it was the day that the general passed away. The bedclothes that are on the bed are the same ones. In any case, I was able to publish the books, sell
And it was
them.
a huge success.
And I wound up giving his wife a check. The first check was for $180,000, $190,000. And the second one was about $90,000 or $95,000. So that did bring the family back to a point that they could live, and I think the general would have been very, very happy with
And
that.
he'd been willing to sell it for $1,500.
He would have taken 15. He would have taken anything, because the family literally had nothing.
Yeah.
And if you ever saw the small cottage they were living in, and this is a gentleman that was so grand and had so much, in his life that he did accomplish, and trying to put the reconcile the states and put the country back together, and to see that the slaves were being treated properly after they had been freed, because it didn't just go away. Mm-hmm. I mean, here in Hartford, we had the slave movement. We didn't have slaves much after the Revolutionary War. I mean, we had quite a few of them, very few. And I think at the time we might have only had 8 or 9 or 10 slaves living in the state. But the law that was passed in this area was that if you were born to a slave that was owned by someone, that you would have to put in 20 years or 21 years of servitude before you were released. But then you theoretically were released a free man or free woman. A lot of those people wound up being traded down south. So there's still a lot of bad things going on in terms of that in the area. But I love this area because in the first states to abolish slavery were Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire. And Hartford was right in there with them as well. But we just kind of did it in a little bit of a different way. And I was always proud that that's the way that it was. And I had some dear, dear friends that were slaves. Back on the farm, on my Uncle John's farm, there was a small community. And every summer when we would arrive, the first thing I would do would be to run as fast as I could down to that little village that they happened to live in. And they were some of my best little friends. My first adult influences, I think, were the older slaves. And I remember using Uncle Daniel. There was an old gentleman, and he used to tell us immortal tales and ghost stories. And I still repeat the golden arm from time to time, but that was Uncle Daniel's story. And I remember sitting on the hearth with the firelight playing on all of our eyes, all of the children, white children, black children. It really didn't matter where we were. And an old Uncle Daniel, telling those stories and trying to scare the bejesus out of all of us. And I've used him throughout my life. And in many stories, he was actually a model for Jim and Huckleberry Finn. And I haven't seen him, obviously, since those days, but what a fine gentleman. And I believe that was probably one of the best ways he could have started a life out in that era, and that they were my friends. They weren't my slaves.
Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Twain?
Would love to answer. And if I can't answer your question, don't you worry, I will lie to you.
Your book, The Gilded Age, with Charles Dudley Warner, makes you a commentator as much on the post-Civil War era as the Civil War era. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you say a little bit more about your observations of what that time was like, on some things we haven't talked about, like the relationship between workers and employers, the labor movement, or gender relations. I don't know if you knew Isabel Beecher Hooker.
Well, Isabella was quite a piece of work. I mean, she spent a lot of time with my wife Olivia. Isabella felt that she could channel an Indian spirit, I believe it was, and she would occasionally do that. But in terms of the way people were treated, it took a long time. It took a very long time for any kind of equality to come. And I don't know that I can answer your question exactly in the manner that you want to hear it, but It was a time of rush and boom and mechanics and machinery. And I've been asked about, at one point in time, and this has nothing to do with it, but I was asked about conservation in the day. And I thought about it, and there was none. And what did people do to take care of the land? Well, what people did was to build a bigger machine that would cut trees down faster, that would build buildings quicker, and there wasn't any thought towards preservation so much at the time. It was just a raging and booming 19th century. I mean, it really was. It was the Industrial Revolution, and it was just a wild time. It was a good time for a good party.
Anyone else with a question for Mr. Twain? Mr. Clements? No? Then I would like to kind of conclude our conversation, since we are here surrounded by holiday finery. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Christmas at Nook Farm.
Do you know that we were responsible, well, partly responsible for bringing the Christmas trees back here to Hartford?
Do tell.
Well, we had spent some time in Germany. And in Germany, I remember we were sitting on another lovely snowy day. We were sitting in the house that we were staying at and looking out at the street. And everybody was bringing a tree, a Christmas tree. And you would see the very wealthy people. They would be walking down the street, and they would have perhaps one of their servants or someone that worked for them dragging a tree behind them, all the way down to the last poor little tree that was left, and the person that could barely afford it would be taking the tree home. And we just thought it was a marvelous, marvelous custom. So we started doing it over at Nook Farm and at the house. And we put candles on the tree, and you had to be very careful. We would light the candles at night, but you had to be careful. And the girls would make ornaments. Boy, that was something. They would string together bits of popcorn and berries. They would hang those on the tree, and they would make their own little cards. And we would place it in the drawing room next to the piano so that we could in turn play some music and then be around the tree. Christmas was a wonderful, wonderful time. I used to call it Olivia's insane suicide mission. Because every year for Christmas, she would spend approximately a month prior to Christmas, maybe even a little bit more. And she would make packages, and she would put things together for the needy and the poor that were in town. And she would package all manner of things, a little food sometimes, some warm gloves. I always joked with her because she liked to give underwear. She gave clean undergarments, which was nice. And perhaps a hat, or maybe a bottle of wine even. And she would package them in the most lovely little way. And she did that in the mahogany room. That was the room that Cables was sick in, by the way, for a month or more. But she would spend all of that time there, and she would work herself into a fever. And then on Christmas Eve, this was the best part. On Christmas Eve, we'd have Patrick McLear, who was the coachman. He had a number of children that lived over there, too. But he'd get the sleigh out if there was enough snow, and if there wasn't, we'd have the carriage, but typically there was enough. And we would load up all of the gifts. Occasionally, we would have to make 2 or 3 trips back to the house. But the girls would get all bundled up, and we would go out in the sleigh, and we would deliver the packages. And it was more or less my job to read off the name of who was to get the package. The girls would in turn find which packet it was, and then Patrick and perhaps one of the girls would run up to the door and deliver it, and then we would come home. But it was just such a wonderful time of the year for parties and people coming over and dinner parties. Christmas was a special time, and it was good for tobogganing as well. I remember on one occasion, a little bit after Christmas, I had been traveling in Canada, and I came across something called a toboggan, and I purchased one. And I sent it home to the girls. And I sent it along with a note that said, be sure not to play with this before I get home. Mainly because I wanted to play with it as much as they did, and I was sure that they wouldn't They wouldn't have any idea what to do with it. But we had that big sloping hill that went out onto the Park River behind the house. And there were a couple of trees there, and you can probably imagine what's about to come. They had all the girls lined up on the toboggan, and we took our rides. It was great. On one of the rides, we hit the darn tree. And Clara, I believe it was a broken arm. Could have been a broken leg. I'm not sure after all these years. Well, she went up to our bedroom and stayed in the bed, which is what all children do when they get ill. And we had a dinner party that had been scheduled. And this was right around Valentine's period. And she was in the bed, and we couldn't cancel the party because you'd have to schedule it a week or two in advance. People would travel in. And I wound up writing about 40 little Valentine cards for her. And then I had George deliver them, one about every 10 or 15 minutes throughout the course of the entire evening because we couldn't be there with her. But it was another winter holiday time. In the summers, we would leave Hartford occasionally, pretty regularly, and we would go to Elmira, and we would stay at the farm with Olivia's family. And mainly that was because the Park River was a little bit aromatic. So we were always around, and it did run right through our backyard, but we were always around in the winter. And we did leave for periods of time in the summer. And then we were able to skate on the Park River and play, and the girls loved it when it was frozen, and there was no problem with the aroma.
Well, Mr. Twain, I want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and thank you for gracing us at the Old State House with your presence. It's been just delightful.
Well, a Merry Christmas to you as well.
Thank you so
Diane.
much.
I have a little piece that I'm going to say right here at the end.
Okay.
And I thought that you might like to hear this. This was published in the Boston Globe, and I used to do that. I would publish. Actually, I published quite frequently in the Hartford Current. And if you look at the newspapers of the day, you would be surprised at the newspapers throughout the country that picked up the articles from the Hartford Current. It was quite amazing. The Hartford Current was the oldest newspaper in the country, and it had a lot to stand on for everyone out there. But I had this published in the Globe in 1890, December 25th. And it is my heart-warm and world-embracing Christmas hope, an aspiration that all of us, the high, the low, the rich, the poor, the admired, the despised, the loved, the hated, the civilized, the savage, may eventually be gathered together in heaven of everlasting rest and peace and bliss, except the inventor of the telephone. That was my Christmas greeting. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
And thank you all for putting up with the likes of me here today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here with us today. And make sure you check this out on CTN.
Thank you.
Thank you.